Today on the bench, I have 3 Matco half-inch air impacts. They're all from the same customer. He found them in the bottom of his toolbox after sitting there for years unused, and he'd like to get at least one good working one out of it, so he tasked me with giving him one good working half-inch air impact. I'll do what I want with the other 2. So the first thing I did was I hooked them all up to the compressor and noticed that this one is the only one whose motor turned. The other ones are frozen, so there's probably more work to be done with those than there is with this, but this one's anvil is all chewed up. You can see the corners are all rounded and hacked up. However, what I found was this one has a pretty good anvil. So I'll at least swap this anvil in for this anvil, and we'll go from there. So first things first, let's take these apart, see what condition they're in, swap out whatever parts I got to swap out. If I have to order some new parts, I will. There are ways to tune this up by replacing the motor blades and some of the gaskets and O-rings. So we'll take a look and see what the condition is of everything in these units, and by the end, we'll have one that works perfect. The first step in disassembling these units is to remove the 4 body screws. These travel all the way through the body and into the hammer housing here to keep the whole unit together. There is a screw missing here. That's okay. We have plenty of ones in the other units to replace that with. So these are a T25 torque screw. You just run those right out, but this one's full of gunk, so we got to take out a whole pile of crap first before we get the bit in there. When you disassemble these units, leave them on a horizontal surface, because when you separate the 2 halves, stuff can fall out. So just keep things horizontal, that way you don't lose anything, stuff's not going to bounce off and roll away. So once these are separated, take the hammer housing here, just turn it on end, and the entire assembly pops out. One thing I like to do is look inside of the housing and see if there's any damage. Sometimes you'll see metal flakes if there's been any breakage on the hammers or the hammer case here, and they strike the inside of the housing. That looks pretty good, but we're also going to degrease everything. So for now, we'll just put this aside and keep going. To remove the anvil, you just twist it and it pulls out of the assembly. But we're going to replace this guy because it's all chewed up. So this guy's going to go in a separate box while we deal with the pieces that we're going to salvage from this one. The 2 hammers come out of the hammer case by pushing these 2 pins out. They just slide right out. So use a pocket screwdriver or something similar, or a pick, and just push out those pins, and then the hammers fall right out. And while I disassemble all these parts, I always look at them to see if I notice any damage. I will continually inspect this at every step of the process. They still have to be degreased and cleaned, so that's going to be our big chance to really look over everything. But right now, these components look pretty good. On the body, there is this body gasket that comes off. You have to note the orientation of this, because there is a tab right here that has to line up with a notch in the hammer housing later. So we just make a note of that, because everything has to be lined up properly. Next, the rotor assembly comes out. Just push on the back of the unit there, and this whole piece slides out by itself. There are a number of components here. We're going to pull the selector switch off. It's usually slippery, so get a pair of pliers to pull that straight out. Just like that. And that's going to expose the front of this. Usually stuff starts coming apart at this stage. There is a plate here that pops off. That's also covered with grease, and there is a bearing that resides in here which fell out on its own. Sometimes you have to reach in there with a pick and work it out. This time it took pity on us and popped right out by itself. The rotor is held in with this snap ring that rests in a groove around the end of the spindle. So just use a pair of snap ring pliers, spread that ring to get it off, and then the rotor will fall right out. And be careful that this snap ring doesn't fly off your pliers and go sailing across the room, because it's very important, so be sure you don't lose it. Now with the ring off, the rotor comes right out. And the plastic rotor blades will also fall out along with that. That's okay, they just sit in these slots in the rotor. So remove all those, and the surface of this rotor is important. It's got to be nice and smooth, so it minimizes the friction when it spins in the housing. The spline drive has to be intact, and it's looking pretty good. On the back of the rotor sleeve here is a bearing. Pop that out. The best way to do that I have found is to take a 90-degree pick and get it into that seam that exists between the bearing and the shoulder it rests on. And then you pull it right out. If you have trouble pulling that out, applying a little bit of heat to this housing can help, but right now that just popped right out. So it can give you trouble because it's just a press fit. And these are shielded bearings, so they shouldn't need to be re-lubricated. But usually for these units, I just replace them because they're dirt cheap, and it's worth doing, especially for a unit that has been used as much as this had and neglected as much as it has been. So look at the rotor sleeve here to see if there's any damage on the inside surface. This one looks pretty good. These rotor blades usually get replaced just as a matter of preventive maintenance on these and part of a tune-up. The directional buttons need to be removed. They're held in with a tab that faces the center divider between them. Take a pocket screwdriver, push it down in there against one of them, then push in to release that tab, and the button will pop right out. Just like that. And I notice that this has some teeth on it because it meshes with the gear on the valve that it switches to change the direction of the airflow. If you don't remove those buttons first, you'll never get the valve out because they hold the valve in place. So to get that valve out, we now have to remove the air inlet assembly, and that's this cylindrical piece here with a valve at the top that goes in the handle. It's held in with tabs that click into a slot on the side of the handle here and a similar slot on the other side of the handle. They make a tool, Ingersoll makes a tool to remove those tabs. I just use a pocket screwdriver. So you push down on the tab and then force it toward the end of the handle, enough for the tab to catch on the inside of the handle, and then do the same on the other side, and this whole thing pulls right out. And if you heard that click, that was the tab on the other side snapping back into place. So sometimes you got to go back and forth a couple of times to make sure it gets positioned properly. And once I think I got it, I then just pull this whole assembly out, usually with a pair of pliers. And the bezel at the base of the handle came off with it. That's all right, we'll just pop that back in place. The clip with the tabs on it here just pulls right off. And usually you don't need to disassemble this any further unless there's a problem with this valve. This is the valve stem that hooks onto the trigger, and the trigger actuates that valve and air passes through when it opens it. It's a simple enough mechanism. It's held in with a snap ring. It's kind of a pain to deal with. So if you don't have to maintain anything in there or replace it, I just leave it intact because there's very little that can go wrong with it. I have seen this valve stem break. I have seen the seats on here wear down, so you might have to replace those on occasion. But right now this seems fine. And when we test it later on, if the air does not flow properly, then we can take a look at the valve. Otherwise, we're just going to leave it. And then this is the air fitting that you screw in there. It's not part of the original equipment, but we leave it in there anyway because it doesn't harm anything. Now with that valve out, you just pull the trigger out, and that's that hook on the end of the trigger that I mentioned that hooks on to that valve stem. This is a directional valve that was held in with those buttons. Just push that down and through the handle, and it pops out. Look for wear on here. There's some very small, delicate plastic pieces that I have seen become damaged in the past when people mess around with this and they don't know what they're doing. So I have seen people wreck the top of the valve here. It has 2 O-rings as well. And these are the geared teeth on here that mesh with those directional buttons I mentioned earlier. And then there's just one gasket left back here. Just pull that straight out. And we're left with an empty body. This has now been completely disassembled. At this point, I wipe everything down, then I take it over to my solvent tank and clean everything thoroughly, let it dry, and as I'm wiping everything down is when I give it a good final inspection. But we have one more thing to do. We have to take the anvil out of the other unit, and that process is exactly the same as the one I just showed you. So we'll use this unit here, remove the body screws, pop that out, take the anvil out, and put it in the box of parts with the one I just disassembled. Haha! Well, it's a good thing I didn't just blindly do this. The anvil is broken. Look at that. You don't see that very often. But the reason this happens is because you can overwork these half-inch impacts. A lot of times people use these to remove lug nuts that have been over-torqued. And when you do that, you create a lot of heat in these assemblies as they're hammering away. That heat changes the temper of the metal, making it brittle. And when that happens, they're going to break. And there's a piece that chunked off. All right, well, plan B, we can't use that anvil. Luckily, we've got another unit whose anvil we might be able to use. This one is intact. Now, is there a possibility that this has become brittle because it had its temper changed? Absolutely, there is. I will note that to the customer and let him know that if this does break, I'll replace it for the parts charge only, and then go from there. That way, he's not paying for an anvil twice, and he's not paying for labor twice. And these other units, I will either keep these for parts. I don't know that it's going to be economical to repair these and try to sell them because you can't ask that much for a used, rebuilt air tool, and the cost of replacing parts and tuning it up may be prohibitive for me. So these will be good parts tools. So I'll take everything apart, clean it, categorize everything, and store it for later use. All the parts I ordered have come in, and I have sent every bit of this tool through the parts washer. It took about a half hour to sit there and scrub and rinse everything away with a solvent. When you do that, though, it's not going to catch everything. So it always works to your benefit to sit down with all the parts after they've been cleaned in the parts washer and go through them with something like Q-tips, toothbrushes, toothpicks even, to get in those really tiny spaces and get all the extra grease out of there that builds up over time that the parts washer won't necessarily get. And it's important because it's amazing how dirty these tools can get, especially if it's never been maintained in the past. Guys will use these things for years and never take them apart, never re-lubricate them, so you have a lot of old, burnt, very viscous grease and oil that builds up in there. It's always worth the time to go through it in a highly detailed manner to make sure you get every bit of grease and grime out of every corner in every piece of the tool. It takes a while, yes, but in the end it's worth it, because you would want your customers to know that you're taking every last bit of care that you could when you repair their vehicles, for example. Take that same care with your tools. It'll last longer and they'll serve you that much better in the long run. Something I found while wiping this down was on the hammer housing. You can see that a burr has formed. Well, maybe you can't see it. It's not easy to show on camera. There you go. That burr formed somehow, and there's one on the other side too. I can only assume it's from being impacted by stuff, because that's awfully beat up. So maybe as things have struck this or people are slamming this in, it causes some of that metal to build up along the edge and kind of roll over like that. So I'm just going to file that down real quick. Okay, after filing this down and taking some fine grit sandpaper to it to remove a lot of the residue, you can see there is some damage to it, and there's these score marks here. They're not very deep. You can barely feel them, and there's some damage around the inner diameter. That's not going to affect the operation because there's a gasket that covers this entire surface. So those do not concern me. If they did, I can take conditioning discs to this and knock the surface down even more to smooth those out. But this will be perfectly adequate for the task at hand. You don't generally see damage to the surface, so I'd love to know what the history is. It's odd. I mean, I clearly this has been taken apart at some point in the past. I don't know what kind of work somebody would be doing that would cause those kinds of striations in there. Maybe they were filing something or working something back and forth, but it's rare, but there it is. And I'm confident, though, that it will not affect the operation. Time for reassembly. The order that you do things matters a bit, but I like to break this up into some chunks, so I reassemble the entire rotor and rotor assembly first, and then I'll do the hammer assembly and then combine the two. How you do it really doesn't matter, but there's some things that you're going to need to do it correctly. One of them is air tool oil. This is for the rotor. This is not for anything in the front of the tool. Everything that goes in here gets oil. It does not get grease. Everything that goes in this part, in the front, gets grease. And that is according to the engineers at Ingersoll Rand. The air tool oil, it does not matter which one you use. Any brand is okay. Do not use Marvel Mystery Oil. It is formulated differently than air tool oil, and Marvel Mystery Oil will gum up and become very bad, and it's corrosive for your tools. Again, according to Ingersoll Rand. They didn't plug their brand of oil necessarily to me. I do use a brand of Marvel Air Tool Oil. This is different than the Mystery Oil. So it's okay to use Marvel brand, just make sure you're using Air Tool Oil. For the grease, This is their 105 grease. It is formulated differently than other kinds of greases, but is not necessarily the only one you can use for the tool. You can use a regular red automotive grease. That's okay. Don't mix the two though, because this has stuff in it that does not interact properly with the red stuff. I think one of them is like a sodium-based grease and the other is, I don't know, petroleum-based or something. I don't really know the differences. Neither did the engineer when I talked to him about this, but his advice was use either. Either's okay, just don't mix them. So I'm using the Ingersoll grease because this cost me the same as the automotive red grease, so why not? So I got a pound of this. That's it for lubricants. We don't go too heavy on the lube, and I'll show you, the basic quantities and stuff as we go through this. All right, so first we're gonna put the housing together. So this has all been cleaned out. We want to first insert the gasket that goes in the back, and I have the new gasket here. There's a lot of details here, so it's a little difficult to see. But on this round piece here, you have this channel, and that channel sets inside this piece back here. It's difficult to see on camera. If you're doing this yourself, it's easy to see because this can only go in one way. Just push it and slide it back. Once you set it in there, just push it back and seat it properly. And then you can also access it from the back if you want to just reach in and pull it back just to make sure it's where it needs to be. Next, we're going to put the valve back in, and there's a couple of O-rings on here, so make sure you lubricate those. You can use a light film of grease or you can use oil. It's important to insert this properly. You can see this tab here. This tab has to be facing toward the rear of the housing, and this inserts up through the hole in the handle. So make sure you orient your valve properly and push it up and through. You'll need something long like a pocket screwdriver or a pick to push that all the way up and seat it correctly at the top. And then when it's pushed up properly, you can see it there. That tab, if it's facing forward, this will not work. So you have to make sure that tab is facing rearward toward the back of the housing. Next, we'll put in our direction buttons. Each of these has teeth on them that mesh with teeth on that valve we just put in. So we're going to put a little bit of lubricant on those. Now there's a trick to this, and you can spend a lot of time being confused if you don't know this one. This tab here has to be positioned 45 degrees off center, and you can tell you have it lined up right when the corner of the tab lines up at the corner of this square piece in the housing. Okay? Now the gears on this, or the teeth on the valve, are aligned properly to accept the directional button. And make sure I push it down a little bit, make sure you pop that back up so it's sitting just above the surface. Like that. You might have to use a pocket screwdriver to push that retainer tab in to have it clear the center line. And then just do the same with the other button. There. Now you'll know this is correct when you put the buttons in. One of them's going to be sticking up, one of them's going to be down. And that tab is lined up with the corners of the square plastic piece, and then when you push the button, it's going to rotate 45 degrees to the other side so that the opposite corner is now lined up with the corner of the square piece. That's how you know this is correct. It is possible to do this incorrectly so that this tab rotates too far down or not far up enough. That is incorrect. It will not work if you do that. So make sure you have this line aligned the way I'm showing you here. Next, the air inlet and throttle valve assembly will go in. And there's an O-ring here, so we're going to use a little bit of lubrication on that. And you have your retainer clip that has to go back on. The tabs, or the ears, whatever you want to call it, here on the bottom, have to face toward the inlet portion of the assembly. And that just locks in place on this section here. Just press it on and it'll snap into where it belongs. Next we'll put the bezel on the bottom there. And when you put the valve assembly in, just make sure you align these ears with the square holes, otherwise it won't fit. There is no left or right, top to bottom of this. Just make sure that you've aligned your ears and everything will fit in perfectly. You might have to use a pocket screwdriver or something to depress those tabs so that they clear the back. And just be mindful of this washer here. It needs to be there, but it's going to come to rest up against the base of the bolster. When I was trying to put everything back together again, I noticed that the bezel piece on here is broken, has a crack in it, so I'm going to discard that. I pulled one off of one of the other tools that I had, and we'll just replace it with this. You can see, if you're got an eagle eye, it's really hard to see on camera, but look through the slot here to make sure that the ears are visible and you can barely see the edge of it shining in the light. There you go. So you know it's set correctly. Next is to put the trigger in. There's a small O-ring on the trigger here. Right there. So a little bit of lube on that. And because the valve stem on the assembly we just put in place is seated correctly, when we push this trigger in, this hook on the end right there is going to engage with the valve stem and it will lock this in. And that just inserts through the hole in the front. And you'll know you got it right when the trigger springs back and you can't pull it out. So the rotor assembly housing is complete. Next, we're going to do the rotor assembly. One thing that surprised me was how really good this rotor is. Normally you see buildup of rust or burned lubricant, but man, this thing would just clean up great. It's nice and shiny. The surfaces here are very smooth, just like you want. I was anticipating having to do a lot of cleanup on this, in which case if yours has rust on it or any buildup, you can take a fine grit sandpaper and oil, put a couple of drops of oil and just sand that down. If you notice any pitting, it's usually not that bad that's going to affect the operation, but if you really had to, chuck this in the drill and spin it and hold a piece of sandpaper to it to get that surface nice and smooth. But as it is, this thing is in great shape. It looks almost new. So the first thing is to reinsert the rotor into the housing. The spindle with the groove on it goes through the back because that's where the retainer ring goes. So you do that, and then you take your press fit bearing and just press it down over everything and make sure that it seats against the shoulder there. And now you put your snap ring in. Whenever you put a snap ring in place, make sure it's seated correctly. So I take a pocket screwdriver and just push it down in there. Sometimes you hear it click. That's when the snap ring is setting into the groove. And to test it, just see if you can very easily, without much effort at all, spin that snap ring around. That means it's seated properly in its groove, and it's not going to come out. If it doesn't spin, it's in there cockeyed, and you got to either push down some portion of it to seat it correctly, or take it out and try to seat it again. But this is really important. If this falls out, then the operation of the tool is going to be impeded, and you're going to have to disassemble the whole thing to get at that anyway. So an ounce of prevention now is worth a pound of cure later. And make sure it spins freely. I have had an instance where I bought a new rotor and there was a small defect in the corner and it prevented it from spinning. If I didn't test that beforehand, I would have been sad because after reassembling the entire tool and finding it didn't work when I tested it, I'd have to disassemble the whole thing. So make sure this is spinning like it should. Next, we put the new rotor vanes in. They're very simple. Just drop them in their slots. And then I like to put a drop of oil on each one as well. When you spin this, you'll see and hear the rotor vanes sliding up out of their slot. That is correct. If something's not moving the way it should, stop and take a look, see if there's any imperfect surfaces, or maybe you don't have enough, I don't know, lube in there, but it should work dry too, so it's really not a lubrication issue. At that point, it's just during functionality that you want the lubrication in there, but everything's spinning freely and the vanes are popping out of their slots like they should. Next, we put the speed switch in the back. And there is an O-ring on here, so a little bit of lubrication. This fits in properly when this tab here goes in the top slot there, and that just presses in. The rotor assembly is now complete. We insert this into the housing and it has to go in a certain way. On the bottom of the rotor assembly is this notch. That notch fits over this square plastic piece on the housing. And you'll know that's seated correctly when the selector switch comes out flush with the back of the housing. This does not protrude out. You can see it flush there. And the spline drive is protruding just a bit above the edge of the housing. Next, the plate goes on. There's also a right and a wrong way to do this. This square hole in the bottom goes against the trigger. And that's also important because the grooves that are in the plate have to line up with the screw holes in the housing. And then press fit bearing goes over the spindle and in. The rotor housing is now complete. Next, we're going to do the hammer assembly. Hammer cage, 2 hammers, the anvil, a bushing, 2 pins. Here's where we're going to go fairly heavy on the lubrication. The hammers are going to need it, as well as the dogs on the anvil. These square pieces here are the dogs. These are the pieces that the hammers strike, causing an impact, turning the anvil. The first thing we'll do is put the hammers back in the hammer cage. lubricate the faces that are going to connect with these. Now, before we do this, I'm going to show you something that's easier to see before I put grease all over it. There's a right way and a wrong way to orient these when they go in the tool. You can see how there's a cutout here that looks like a ghost with his arms up. Both are identical. Make sure one of them is inverted so that the ghost has his arms facing down. These go on top of each other like that. This is the correct orientation. So we're going to put grease on the mating surfaces of those hammers as well as the outside surfaces. These just drop in to the hammer cage, and you can see how you have a narrow slot and a wider slot on either side of this assembly. Those drop in like this because you want these slots to line up with these pinholes. Just like that. Then you take your pins and insert them. The first one goes in pretty easy. The second one you might have to jiggle the hammers a little bit to line it up. Now that hammer assembly is correct. We're going to put lubrication on this. But don't turn this on end or those pins are going to fall out and you have to put it all back together again. Take the anvil and grease up the dogs on here pretty good. And the anvil just inserts in the wide hole there. You're going to have to jiggle it a couple of times to get the dogs to fit past the hammers. Once you're in place, every time you turn that, you'll see the hammers move. Take your bushing and insert that in the hammer housing. And then put some grease on the inside of the housing and some grease on the outside surfaces of the hammer assembly. As a maintenance item, there is a grease zerk on the outside of this housing, so you can apply your own grease to this over time. Make sure you use it. A lot of guys don't even know it's there. And we're going to put grease on the outside surfaces here. Just be careful because things are slippery and can slide out on you. And then this just slides in to the housing like that. Make sure your mating surfaces are clean between the two housings we're going to put back together again. A couple of things we want to make sure of. First, we want to be sure that the holes are all aligned correctly on the rotor housing. If these holes are misaligned that accept the body screws, this is not going to go back together again, and you're going to drive yourself crazy wondering why you can get 3 screws in but not the 4th one. Ask me how I know. So just take an extra moment to be sure all your screw holes are lined up. If the plate was a little off like that, it's going to be a sad time. Or if you had the plate upside down, then the holes won't align because 2 of these holes are closer together than the other 2. Be sure that the tab on the gasket here is facing up and against the trigger, because that tab is going to fit into this notch on the hammer housing. Next to the body screws, and we're going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on the threads. When you start to tighten these screws, go slow to make sure everything's aligned right, that you're not cross-threading anything. And when you go around these first, do not over-tighten them, because you don't want to mash your gasket and put too much pressure on any one portion of its surface. So I just do this very lightly just to make sure that the screws are going where they need to, that they're threading properly. And now that I'm confident I have everything aligned correctly, I can go through a tightening sequence on these screws. Because you're tightening a gasket, you want to apply even pressure to the whole thing. So tighten screws in a cross sequence and do it progressively. So we're going to tighten a little bit, increase the torque to tighten a little more. Fully reassembled, ready to go. We're going to take this out to the compressor and give it a test. Let's see if it works. Forward, reverse. Screaming right along just like it should. I'm pretty confident when these go back together that easily, there's not going to be any problems when I hook it back up to the compressor to test. But it's always worth doing, just in case you miss a step. Better now than put it back in the hands of the customer and say, hey, this thing doesn't work. So do me a favor, keep watching the channel, because I've got a really interesting 3/4 inch Matco impact repair to show you. It got weirder the deeper I dug, so you're not going to want to miss that. We've got more tools in the haul videos. We're going to be doing some firearm reviews as well, and a whole bunch of other things. So do me a favor, click down here now to subscribe so you don't miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, use a tool. Don't be one.